welcome to our video from Socks Against Suicide on how to create 2 at a time toe-up socks. This is part 2. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, please do go and see that, which is called casting on and knitting the toe. So hopefully you've now got to this stage where you've knitted your toe, knitted the body of your sock, the foot of your sock, and you want to stop 2 inches before the end of the heel, or if you slip your foot into the sock, then it's where your heel bone comes down and meets it is where you want to stop and start knitting the heel. Now with this we do knit 2 at a time, but when it comes to the heel you have to do the first one and then you go on to the second one. And so I've done the first one so I can show you that. Now normally I use what's known as a fish lips heel, and if you Google it you'll come across it, and you can buy the pattern for about $1. I'd really recommend it. It's the best heel I've come across, but because that's copyrighted material we can't share it with you, and therefore I'm sharing in this pattern a short row heel. To be honest, I don't do this heel very often. I've had to practice it so I could show it to you. It's not a bad heel. The problem with it is that you sometimes get gaps here and here, so I'll show you how we can try and solve that problem. But if you look at your sock, you'll realise that your toe and the heel are actually the same shape. So you can have confidence that you can do this because you've already done something very similar. So remember, you knit 2 at a time until you come to the heel, and when you've done the heel you then do the first sock. Once you finish the heel on that sock you go on to the second sock. To knit our sock heel we're going to divide all the stitches on here into 3, and for this it's often useful to use stitch markers. Because our pattern works on 30, I don't tend to use stitch markers because I can count up to 10 3 times. But when you're first doing it, it might be useful to use stitch markers. So as I do this first row, I'm going to be knitting across to the very last stitch, and as I go along, I'm going to put a stitch marker between after the 10th and the 20th stitch to divide it into 3. Stitch markers come in all sorts of varieties. These are useful because you can pin them on and off, so if I wanted to do it without having to knit across I could just pin that and do it up. Or these are some that I particularly like that say read and knit, 2 of my favourite things. So I'm going to knit along here, adding the stitch markers in, and I'll meet you again at the very last stitch. Right, I'm now at this last stitch, and this is where we're going to do our first wrap and turn. So you're literally going to bring the yarn forward, slip your stitch onto here and turn your work. On the other side, the purl side, you now slip that stitch onto your right hand needle and start purling. And as you can see, that has created the yarn to wrap that stitch, and we now purl along the whole row until you get to the final stitch on that row. And now at the final stitch on our first purl row, so this time I'm going to move the yarn to the front, slip that stitch onto the right needle, turn my work around, and wrap the yarn round that way, slipping this stitch off to the right hand side without knitting it. And can you see that's wrapped the yarn around that? So you now work alternate rows, knitting and purling, and at the end of each row you wrap the stitch before the previous wrap stitch. So I'm going to knit to the second to last stitch on this row and wrap that. When you come to the stitch markers, you simply move them across onto the next needle. If you're not used to working with them, you just move it across like that. So following the pattern, you're going to wrap and turn all the stitches going in, and I'll show you as I go along. I just wanted to show you where we were now that I've done 4 rows. So this is how it looks with 4 rows of wrap stitches on the purl side and on the knit side. So we're gradually shaping our foot into a wedge like that, and I'm going to continue now wrapping the stitches on both sides, and then until I reach the stitch markers, and I'll be coming back to you when we've got to this point. We're now at the point where I've got 10 wrap and turns on each side and 10 untouched stitches in the middle. So I'm now going to just slip that marker across and then knit these 10 stitches, and then we're going to start picking up the wrap and turns. So we now need to pick up the wrap. If you can't see this very clearly on this video, I'm afraid I'm not very skilled at video making. There may be better videos that you can see on YouTube, but basically I'm putting my needle into where we wrapped that stitch, and then I'm putting it next to the stitch on the needle, and I'm knitting through both of them. And then I'm going to wrap this stitch. Now that stitch is already wrapped, so it's going to be a double wrap. So I'm going to slip the yarn forward, slip that stitch onto the right needle, put the yarn behind it, and slip the stitch back onto the left needle. That double wraps it, and it gives you a much stronger heel with no holes in it. So now I'm going to turn my work, purl that stitch that I have just worked on, slip the stitch markers and knit across those 10 to the first wrap stitch on the other side. Here we need to do the same thing, but to do it on a purl side, you slip the stitch onto the right needle so that you can pick up the wrap. Then you put the stitch next to the wrap and purl through them both, like that. And again, we want to wrap this stitch, so we're double wrapping the stitch next to it. So slip it over, put the yarn around the back of it, slip it back and turn my work. And now I'm going to knit back. So I've knitted back across the 10 stitches in the middle. I've got my stitch marker, and here's the first stitch we were working on last time. So we just knit that one, and this is our first double wrap stitch. So again, we want to pick up the wrap and put it on to our stitch next to the stitch, but we also want to pick up the other wrap that's underneath it and put it onto that stitch. And now you're going to knit through all 3 at the same time. Just slip your needle through all 3, knit through those, and again wrap the stitch next to it. And then turn your work. I'm now going to knit across all the stitches back again to where we did that first stitch past the stitch marker. I'm now back at the stitch marker on the purl side, so I'm going to slip that over. I'm going to purl the first stitch that we'd already worked on. This is now our first double wrap stitch. So I slip the stitch onto the right hand needle. I use the left hand needle to pick up the 2 wraps. I put the stitch back on from the right hand needle, put my needle through all 3 stitches and purl them together. And then we want to wrap this stitch, so I push it over onto the right hand needle, put the yarn behind it and flip it back onto the left. Bring the yarn round again, and turn my work. So you're now going to work all of these stitches on either side in exactly the same way by picking up the double wraps on each side. So now I've finished my second heel, and I have to say I'm really pleased with how this one worked out. I'm not familiar with using this technique, and my first attempt, as you can see on the first side, was a bit lumpy and bumpy. This second one has come out, that's the lumpy bumpy one. This one has come out much smoother, much nicer, and it is actually a technique I will use because now I've got the hang of it, I quite like it. So that's the short row heel. We now continue knitting round and round as normal to make the ankle of the sock, and you can make that as long or short as you want. One of the criticisms of the short row heel is that it can tend to cause gaps here. You can get a little hole here when you start again. There's two things you can do with that. You can either live with it and sew it up when the sock's finished if it bothers you, or what I like to do in this sort of circumstance, and it does actually help give a little bit more give to the sock over the ankle, is to just pick up a couple of spare stitches, and then on the next couple of rounds I'm going to decrease those again. So simply put your needle in and create a stitch, a couple of stitches in this gap here, like that, and then carry on knitting in the round. When you get to this gap, you're going to create 2 more stitches. On the next round you're going to decrease one of those stitches, and on the following round you'll decrease another one, so you'll be back to 30 stitches on each needle, and you should find that that works really well. So that's how you do your short row heels, one at a time on the socks, and then knit your ankle to as long as you want. And the next video we're going to be doing is how to do a cuff. I would say that there is no right or wrong way to do your heel. There's lots of different techniques. Just feel free to try different ones, but just bear in mind, if you have got 2 socks on the magic loop method, something like the German short row heel probably won't work for you. So my favourites are the fish lips heel, and I now really like the short row heel as well. So those are a couple of choices for you. Happy knitting!